The UK has already collapsed, you just don't know it yet. There's been a cycle of news following the British economy, and for one of the first times, it isn't entirely false. The truth is that the UK economy is in an awful state, and actually the entire country is in an awful state. We have just seen the UK officially enter a recession. Every person is feeling poorer, and you can't even watch the news without someone talking about the cost of living crisis. All the while, rents and property prices continue to shoot up and wages continue to stay low. Now, this is all being reported on by the media, but what isn't being talked about is how the true state of the country is far worse than this would all suggest. In reality, there is one major issue that isn't being talked about or discussed at all that is disguising our figures and statistics and dragging us into the ground. Because the British economy truly is screwed, but in this video, I'm going to expose everything that the mainstream media is fighting so hard to hide from you, so listen in. So what is that headline news? What is the mainstream media actually talking about? Well, put simply, the UK economy is shrinking and it is now officially in a recession. In the fourth quarter of 2023, that saw out the end of last year, the UK economy shrank by 0.3% after already falling by 0.1% the quarter before that. And to make matters worse, this wasn't following a strong degree of growth in the first half of 2023, as that was actually characterized by stagnation more than anything else. In fact, this is what the UK's GDP looks like over the last few years. Of course, there was a fair rebound following the COVID recession, but that was to be expected as the drop-off was forced by lockdowns and government restrictions. The real state of the economy is that trillions of pounds were printed and thrown into the economy, which caused massive amounts of inflation, but it didn't actually stimulate any growth or wealth. And so ever since 2022, really, the British economy has just been stagnant. And in 2023, it actually just fell outright. Of course, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is what constitutes a recession in every country in the world, except, of course, for Joe Biden's America. But we all know why that is. So we've now had a tough few years, but in the grand scheme of things, is this really so bad? After all, this graph showing the British economy doesn't look too awful, right? Yes, COVID was a big hit and the 2008 recession took its toll as well, but at least we were seeing steady, consistent growth in our output and productivity from that trough in 2008 all the way up until COVID took us down in 2020. Well, the problem is we're looking at the UK in isolation here, and so the true problem with our output is not really visible. When we look at how the UK used to perform before the Great Recession and before the financial crisis in 2008, things start to look a hell of a lot worse. And that's exactly what this graph here shows us. We can see the UK's economy was far stronger back in the 1990s and 2000s, with steady growth that was actually on par with some of the wealthiest and most successful countries in the world like the US. But the financial crisis truly took its toll on the UK, and whilst it may seem like we've recovered enough, the reality is there's a massive gap between where the UK should be and where it actually is today. And the size of this gap is 31%, meaning that the average person is 31% poorer than they needed to be in the UK because of this underperformance. That's £23,000 per household per year, or roughly $30,000 per household per year lost in the UK. For comparison, if the US saw a hit that large, it would go roughly from the 6th richest real economy in the world to the 20th, removing roughly 30% of the entire country's wealth. And in reality, COVID only made up a small proportion of that problem, and Brexit an even smaller hit. The truth is that the UK has been on decline for over 15 years now, and the root cause of these issues goes so much further than just a stupid EU good, Brexit bad. And of course, none of this is even considering adjusting this data for population or inflation, because when you do, things get so much worse. This graph here shows exactly that. American GDP per capita plotted against British GDP per capita, and as you can see, the UK used to have an economy as strong as the US's when adjusted for population, but the UK has seen a massive drop-off since the Great Recession and really has seen average wealth per citizen stagnate for the best part of 7 years now. There has been no increase in the wealth or productivity in the UK for almost 7 years now. For an advanced economy that has the potential to grow as quickly as the US and used to grow as quickly as the US for decades, to have seen a literally zero productivity growth in 7 years is absolutely insane and a clear depiction of just why the UK is so screwed. Now, we're about to get on to the really controversial part of the video, the stuff that the mainstream media literally refuses to comment on at all, and as is always the case with YouTube, that means this video is at very high risk of getting demonetized, censored, or just outright banned. I can't even count how many of my videos have been suppressed at this point, and it's incredibly likely that this one will be too. As a result, I can't really state everything as it is on this video, and you will simply never be able to watch this video if I did, because the YouTube algorithm would kill it off. So if you're really interested to know the whole truth about why the UK is so screwed, with all the gloves off and no punches pulled, I'll be releasing an email newsletter tomorrow explaining absolutely everything. It's 100% free to sign up, and you can do it with the link just down below in the comments or the description. And of course, you can always unsubscribe at any time, no questions asked. So go click that link to find out the whole truth before I send that email out. Now, immigration is the dirty word that no media outlet dare speak about in the UK, even though it is disguising the true problems this country is facing. And actually, it's causing a hell of a lot of problems too. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not allowed to talk about that on YouTube, so head on over to the email newsletter with the link down below to hear about that. Since 2008, more than 10 million immigrants have come into the United Kingdom, a country of only 15 million native Brits, where 17 million immigrants have already made their home. This influx of immigration is not the trend for the vast majority of British history, despite what the BBC will tell you. It is a new development that has accelerated to a ridiculous degree over the last decade. Over 2023 alone, more than 1.2 million immigrants came into the United Kingdom. The British population has been soaring, and not from births, but from immigration. This distorts our GDP figures to a ridiculous degree, and it's something every mainstream media outlet refuses to talk about, leading to the vast majority of people just having no idea how bad the figures really are. When a recession is declared, we have to have had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which the UK has now had. As I mentioned earlier, GDP fell by 0.3% over the last few months, a fair hit in the best of times, and not good news for the economy at all. But this actually happened at the same time as 300,000 brand new people came into the United Kingdom, and they increased our population figures by exactly that much. So in reality, GDP per capita for the UK fell by 0.7% over the last quarter alone. That is a monstrous figure that is twice as bad as the headlines would suggest, and it's all being disguised by these huge levels of immigration the country is seeing. And because the media refuses to talk about this, most people just have no idea how bad things really are. And to make things worse, the political establishment hasn't just allowed this to happen by accident. They want it to happen because they know these immigration figures are needed to boost those numbers to disguise how they're running the country headfirst into the ground. And all the while, we've seen the public sector in the UK continue to expand despite failing to achieve any kind of productivity growth at a time when the private sector is exploding with productivity and driving wealth for billions of people around the world. This graph here shows just how dire the entire problem is. The British economy is dominated by the state, by the government, which is always irrefutably ineffective, inefficient, and an awful driver of wealth. This graph shows it all so perfectly. The public sector is as inefficient today as it was more than 25 years ago. The invention of computers, phones, the internet, even AI, and public sector workers are no more efficient than they were before all of that. All the while, the private sector, individuals, entrepreneurs, businesses, and capitalists have driven a 40% increase in productivity over that exact same time period. And the starkest evidence of the state's failure is what actually happened over COVID. When the world was forced to shut down, the private sector got more efficient. Companies were scared and struggling, so they had to innovate to find efficiency gains, and that made the entire sector more efficient and better at creating wealth. Whilst the private sector dropped off a cliff and simply decided to stop working because what they do isn't important and isn't necessary. The truth is simple. Governments cannot create wealth. They can only stop capitalists from creating wealth. And in the UK, we are being drowned in a sea of public sector idiocracy. We're being drowned by government institutions who can't do anything correctly, by bureaucracy and failure, by NHS waiting times and a pension state that subsidises the elderly at the expense of the young and houseless. And to guarantee the UK's failure in the years to come, there's no political alternative. Labour and the Conservatives are two sides of the same coin. They are both statist, power-hungry career politicians who never could have succeeded in the real world, so instead they migrated over to a life in politics where their failures can be covered up and excused by other people's failures. Unfortunately, there is much more I have to say, especially about immigration and why it's so damaging to the British economy, but it is simply something that YouTube will not allow on this platform. So if you want to know the whole truth, go on down to that link in the description and register for free. But beware, because this email will be sent out shortly, so you need to sign up before then if you're to receive that specific newsletter. And as always, you can unsubscribe anytime you'd like, no questions asked at all. So I'll see you next time.